What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I'm going to continue my conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. What you're looking at is a illustration by Ted Carroll. Ted Carroll was a phenomenal cartoon artist, but he was a very good writer. And I just wanted to show you this as an illustration. We're not talking about Henry Armstrong, because that's who you're looking at. We're still in the middle of 1942. In 1942, we'll probably get out of 42 into 43 in this video. If not, we'll pick up 43 in the next video. But 42 was very, very important because it introduced a lot of great black fighters during that time. Now, Charlie Burley had fought 16 times, and I had mentioned that to you once before. In that 16 times of 1942 alone, he was in the ring with Holman Williams. Now, he fought Holman Williams a total of 7 times. There were 3 wins, 3 losses, and 1 no contest. Friday, October 16th, 1942, Holman Williams, who was the colored middleweight champion, he would face Charlie Burley at the Municipal Auditorium in New Orleans, and he would lose in 15 rounds. Now, Charlie Burley stood 5'9". He had a 75-inch reach. He was 25 years old. He had a record of 53 wins, 7 losses, 1 draw, and 33 knockouts. As for Holman Williams, who was 27 years old, he stood 5'10.5". He had a 71-inch reach and had a record of 96 wins, 14 losses, 6 draws, and 32 knockouts. Holman Williams was born January 30th, 1915 in Pensacola, Florida. He would die July 5th, 1967 in Akron, Ohio. I spoke to you about how he died in Wonder Club. Unfortunately, an accident. It was a place where he worked, and it burned up while he was sleeping. Now, he was 5'10", 3/4 inches. He weighed 147 pounds for this fight. He was managed by Julian Black and John Roxborough. Now, Julian Black and John Roxborough, they were number runners. They were known in the streets. But they were managers for Joe Louis. And they would pick up Holman Williams because Holman Williams, believe it or not, trained Joe Louis many a times in the gyms. And the combination of Holman Williams was a combination that Joe Louis would land on Billy Conn in about 1941 when Billy Conn was stopped in 13 rounds. Now, Holman Williams had a complete record of 187 bouts, 110 wins, 35 knockouts, 27 losses, and he was stopped 3 times and had 1 no contest, and that was to Charlie Burley. Now, when you look at Charlie Burley was probably one of the most underrated fighters. He's becoming more popular now than he was in the middle, I would say in the 90s and the 80s with the casual fans, even fans who kind of knew who Ray Robinson was, but didn't know who Charlie Burley was, or for that matter, the Black Murdersrow. He's becoming more popular now because of the internet and the buzz is going around about Charlie Burley. But Charlie Burley was always a avoided fighter. He was always well respected. There were other fighters besides the Black Murdersrow. I just want to make that clear because it doesn't seem like many understand that. Now, to remind you of some of the opponents Holman Williams was in the ring with. Archie Moore. Archie Moore was a very hard puncher in his weight division. Now, to give you an idea about Charlie Burley, he would face Lloyd Marshall twice. He fought Archie Moore twice. Steve Belois. Izzy Genazzo 3 times. Eddie Black Dynamite Booker. I want you to pay attention to the names that I am mentioning to you. Coco Kid. Now, Holman Williams faced Coco Kid 9 times. Jack Chase 3 times. Burt Lytell 4 times. Paul Jr., Luther Slugger White. I don't know if you quite understand the description of the opponents, because these opponents were all Hall of Fame fighters as far as I'm concerned. And when you look at these kind of fighters, I mean, you're talking about top 10 rated fighters here. And Holman Williams, Charlie Burley, Coco Kid, all of them, had faced one another. And the debates that you have today on who do you think will win between some modern day fighters, who, by the way, and I want to be very clear, who I respect dearly because they're going to one day be historical fighters. And they will be placed by me based on the activity that they have. And it's unfortunate because of the activity. They're nowhere near the conversation of these fighters. Now, yes, they're starting to fight one another, but those are regular fights at that time. And this is what I'm trying to get you to understand. That Charlie Burley, he faced Holman Williams 7 times. Coco Kid faced Holman Williams 14 times. So if you get a fight out of one of these guys, and maybe they fought a second time, that is an average fight for the time in the area in which I'm talking about. So it's not an excitement. It's something that you want to see. It's a legacy fight for your era of watching the fights. You see it in real time. And that should be celebrated and appreciated. But it's very difficult because the bar has been set too high for this era to, I wouldn't say compare to, because it's unfair to compare them because there is no comparison. But the actual excitement in watching fights in current boxing today, as opposed to those who had the privilege of watching fights in the era of yesteryear, in their time. So I hope I was clear in that because, again, modern day fighters will be historical fighters one day. And they will be celebrated based in the era in which they came. They would never be in the platform of yesterday's era because they cannot be. No matter how many nooks and crannies you try to find, well, he did this. He's not in the same class. He's not in the same level. He didn't fight in different arenas. He didn't go abroad. He didn't fight a couple times in a month. You know, there's no comparison. He just has 2 arms and legs like the other fighters. Nothing better than him. The issue is he was never challenged enough with the activity rate, with the top 10 rated fighters on a consistent level. So there was absolutely zero comparison. But when the time comes for them to be historical fighters, they will be judged accordingly in the era in which they came, because that's as far as they can go. And that's the fault of the fighters, the time in which they came. Is it more difficult getting fights today? Yes. Yes. Are they being paid more so they don't have to fight as often? Yes. That's no fault when you put them in a category of historical conversations. So it is what it is. And I just want to make that very clear. You know, in fact, let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of what I'm really talking about when I measure fighters. Let's stick with Black Murdersrow for one moment. Black Dynamite Eddie Booker. That's who you're looking at now. He was born November 5th, 1917 in Texas. Alto, Texas to be exact. He died January 26, 1975. He was 57 years of age at the time of his arrest. And he would reside in San Jose, California. Here's a man who stood 5'9". He was a middleweight and had a 79-inch reach. Had a record of 79 total bouts, 68 wins, 5 losses, 33 knockouts, 3 draws, and 8 very controversial. Well, I'm not going to mention. There's circumstances that happened with him. He fought from 1935 and 1944. He was in the ring with fighters such as Herbert Lewis Hardwick, Bobby Poncho, Holman Williams, and Harry Kid Matthews, who would eventually move up and face Rocky Marciano. I want you to think about that. Jack Chase, Little Joe Louis, Archie Moore, the Old Mongols, Lloyd Marshall, Izzy Genazzo, Shorty Hughes, Fritzy Zivic. Take a listen to those names. His first 16 bouts between January 15th, 1935 and December 30th, 1935, all wins, 8 decisions, and 8 knockouts. Between April 13th, 1936 and November 24th, 1936. Eddie Booker had 9 fights, 8 wins, 1 draw. Between January 26, 1937 and October 8, 1937. He had 8 bouts, 8 wins, 2 knockouts, 1 draw. This is incredible. 5 decision wins. Between January 14th, 1938 and December 20th, 1938, he had 8 bouts, 7 wins, 1 draw, 3 knockouts. Between January 25th, 1939 and December 18th, 1939, he had 8 bouts, 5 wins, 1 draw, 2 losses, and 4 knockouts. He drew in Holman Williams, lost to Fizzy Zivic, lost to Herbert Lewis Hardwick at that time. Now, 1940, he defeated Bobby Pancho. Between February 4th, 1941 and December 1st, 1941, he had 15 bouts, 2 draws, 1 loss, 13 wins, and 5 knockouts. He drew with Archie Moore, Shorty Hughes, lost to Shorty Hughes. He defeated Archie Moore. He had 2 wins against Shorty Hughes. He would win the California Middleweight Championship strap from Shorty Hughes. August 14th, 1945. He would lose to Jack Chase, January 11th, 1943, for the California State Middleweight Championship strap. And he would lose. Defeated Big Boy Hughes, defeated Lloyd Marshall, defeated Archie Moore. There's not much more that can be said about Eddie Booker. Jack Chase defeated Eddie Booker for the California State Middleweight Championship title. Jack Chase defeated Watson Jones for the California State Light Heavyweight Championship title. So when you look at Eddie Booker, you look at Coco Kid, Charlie Burley, Holman Williams, Jack Chase, Little Tiger Aaron Wade, Lloyd Marshall, Burt Lytell. These men were put in categories where they were facing one another. And that's why they are specifically mentioned as Black Murdersrow. But there were other fighters in those categories. Broadway, Oakland, Billy Smith was a fighter who has a tremendous boxing record. It was very difficult for his manager to get him the work that he needed. And this is what's misunderstood. Yes, Sam Baruti from Ohio. He had difficulties getting the proper work that he needed to get. Yet Alan Faulkner of Buffalo, New York, he had difficulties getting the matches he needed to get. Joe Blackwood, Philadelphia, had difficulties getting the matches that he needed to receive. There was a fighter, Detroit's O'Neal Bell. A lot of people don't know about him. Yet Danny Bang Bang Wapner had an opportunity to face Kid Gavilan. Did very well in that match. There was a lot of New York fighters that are not so often mentioned. I've mentioned many of them, Wapner being one. You had a fighter named Danny Cox, who did very well in the amateurs. He was part of the Harry Wiley and the New York management. See, my point is this. Although I've spoken to you about 1900s to the 1942s, heading towards 1943, what needs to be understood is when we judge the era of fighters, and you look at certain, this guy would have did this to him and he would have done that to him. That may be the case or that may not be the case, but you also have to take a look at the time in which the man came. I've always said that since I've been on YouTube. Because there were certain eras where the mob would not allow a fighter to win. There were certain fighters the mob were not allowed to box. He had to slug. he had to turn southpaw. He was dictated in how he had to perform. And that's why when you mention certain names of modern time, you have to be careful before you make those statements, because the fighter of modern time may have a little more leeway in what his decisions could be. When you mention fights that took place in the 20s, be careful if you don't understand the era, because there's certain things then that wasn't put in place. Remember, I told you the Walker Law didn't begin until 1920. Before that, you had the Hawthorne Law, and on and on. They didn't pay taxes during that time. Jim Corbett's bout is what changed the Hawthorne Law. And Jimmy Walker decided to create a new set of laws. That's when the Walker Law came into play. So you have to understand these things before you can really make comparison of fighters, because things were different. Well, these guys would have trashed those guys. That's a mindset of a person who has absolutely zero understanding on boxing. When you hear that kind of person talk, you can immediately turn him off and focus on learning something that you should learn, because that kind of conversation is a waste of time. One of the things that I've learned when I was a younger man, and my dad taught me, and he was very, very diligent in how he explained these things to me, and I learned from Teddy and others. I learned from a lot of the old-time guys in Philadelphia gyms when I used to go down there as a young man, when I would go over to New York gyms, Queens, different places. I tell you, this is all I've done since I didn't have a childhood. Once I was the age of 7, this is all I did. There was nothing else. And I would study and everything else. I would have conversations with the old-time guys. And when I got old enough to travel on my own, I traveled all over the place. Pennsylvania, just to go to a gym, just to speak to someone. I had a job, and I would chance coming back in time to make it to the job, because it meant that much to me to go over just to get an autographed picture from someone, just to go and have a conversation with someone about something. When I was freelancing as a journalist, I would go all the way to Schenectady, New York, to see an amateur bout, hoping to make it back to clock in. And this is when I was working a 9 to 5. And then I got out of that and began my own real estate. But the thing is, I have watched this my entire life. And I actually see era by era of things changing. And that's why when I refer to the Black Murdersrow, I refer to black fighters, I can tell you the treatment that they received, because I've spoken to a lot of them. Yes, I told you I spoke with Charlie Bill, yes. I have spoken to Sandy Sadler, Archie Moore, Ray Robinson, Henry Armstrong, Bo Jack, Ike Williams, many, many, many fighters. And I can assure you, now I've spoken to Fizzy Zivic, I've spoken to many, many, all across the board. But the treatment that black fighters received is why you have to be important when you make judgments as to who would have done what to how. Now, I've thoroughly researched the Harry Wells, Brown Panther, circumstance with Jack Dempsey. And I've thoroughly researched the Peter Jacksons and Gentleman Jim Corbett, and Peter Jackson and John L. Sullivan. I did a segment on this series about that. And there are many circumstances where the evidence have been researched and revealed. When Fritzy Zivik faced Henry Armstrong the first time in 1940, October 4th, to be exact, that was the professional debut of Ray Robinson. We know this already. What we really don't know and is unclear of that Ray Robinson attracted the audience. It wasn't the match with Henry Armstrong Fritzy Zivik because many thought Henry Armstrong was going to defeat Fritzy Zivik. He was somewhat below the 500 mark when he got in the ring with Armstrong. So what filled up that arena and why that was done, because they knew Ray Robinson can put butts in the seats. So once Ray Robinson began to understand this, and by the way, he was younger than was pronounced when he got in the ring that evening because he went under a different name. But he understood that, and that's when he began to market himself and started to demand more money than what he was being given. So many people resent Ray Robinson because he was the toughest negotiator in all of boxing. What they fail to understand, most of that is jealousy and envy. But what they don't understand is what Robinson and those of Robinson's descent had to go through, what they had to deal with. And they've been mistreated monetarily, mistreated on a legacy level because they were handicapped as to what they could do and or get away with. So I just wanted to make that crystal clear. And I know I'm supposed to be talking about 42, but this is 1942. But I just wanted to make sure that we really understand the passion behind the eras in which we speak. And me specifically, having spoken to a lot of the fighters that I talk about, I can hear the passion in their voice. I can hear the opportunities that they wish they really had. They would tell me, oh, I could have whipped this guy, but they tell me this. They tell me what took place in sparring of a guy they fought in a real match, and they had to be handcuffed. And so I understand what took place. The evidence was all around me. I've been to so many historians' homes who, I'll say this, I'm not going to mention any names. There was someone from New Jersey, had the pleasure of going to their home. And they invited me down to the basement. In that basement, the entire basement, in fact, it was a 2-room basement. Both rooms were completely full and filled with memorabilia. From wall to wall, in the middle of the room. In fact, there was a glove rack that he had. Gloves signed by every fighter historically. And those gloves were worn in historical fights. Magazines, boxing cards, posters, glasses, everything that you can think of. It's a museum. And I had conversations with that gentleman about what we're talking about or what I'm discussing with you. The evidence is there. I've spoken to someone who was actually cleaning up in a barber shop, sweeping floors in Harlem. I heard from him. I heard from someone who worked in a bar who was wiping the countertop. Told me about the Ray Robinsons and the Henry Armstrong because he was there. These old timers, when I spoke with them, yes. But their memories were clear as a bell. They didn't know one another. And I'm hearing basically the same story. So I understand the Jack Chases who was Little Joe Louis and then Jack Chase, to Holman Williams. I understand what they had to deal with based on the conversations that I had with them specifically in the books that I read. There was a time where the information that many are getting today, you had to go to a library and research that information for yourself. Now, yes, there are certain libraries that had projectors and they had fight films. There were some libraries had newspapers. They don't have them like that now. They're digitalized, but they used to have old newspapers that you could take a look at. You couldn't take them home, but you would sit in the back of the library at a table and you would open them up. You would take notes of what you read. Those newspapers are on the internet now. There were old magazines that you could get from the library, your public library. Because some old timer had gotten old and family member donated it to a library. And if you were fortunate, the library near you might have been the gold mine in gold heaven of an old time fighter whose family member would be kind enough to donate those artifacts too. Well, I traveled to many states going to libraries, going to many college universities and their library where they have deep archives. And I would sit down, I would do research, and I would jot down notes and information. I'm going to say it, but there were times when you went to the dentist. Now, I'm going back in the 80s on this one. And you would sit there, they had Sports Illustrated, and they would even have boxing magazines. And I would, put my jacket over it, and before you know it, I don't know what happened to the magazine. I'm a young man, so it's safe to say that was the case at that time. But the point of saying all this was the passion of what one would have before one would make a sincere suggestion on what that person's opinion would be. You have to deep dive. You have to understand. It's not everything that you read. I've been trying to get people's heads to understand about the Ray Robinson, Sammy Ing guy. There are people who are authors, who do research, are going to argue with me because they don't know. They know what they've read, they know who they've spoken to, but they don't really know. Not a lot of people know certain stories. It is what it is. I was fortunate enough to meet a lot of people in my life who I can get information from, and I know the insights. I've spoken to certain fighters themselves. There's many stories that I don't even mention on YouTube because I can't necessarily prove it. Because I've spoken to them, I've spoken to promoters at that time who did it, who told me what happened. They did it. But it's not documented. So what's the use? Anyway, I just wanted to have that short conversation with you. I'll pick up the rest of the 42-43 conversation as I go through the next video. Like I said, when I talk to you in this series, everything is through conversation. I'm not reading anything. I'm not looking at anything. I'm not researching anything. I've been there, done that. I'll show you some scrapbooks with some articles from time to time. I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm not going to show you any very important things anymore because of the issue that I had. Some of the photos that I now show you, I have a somewhat watermark, and that will be limited as well. I'm working on a project where some of those images will be on there, some of those photos. And you'll see a good amount of information. You'll see some photos that you probably haven't seen. I'm going to try and pack as many photos as I can and give you some small details, not a lot of information, but small details on the fighter as far as the profile. I'll show some articles. Those are all legally mine. And we'll see how it turns out. But Thanks for listening. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. All great fights, all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. Respect the fighters that you admire. Talking about this fighter over that fighter, calling this fighter names and all that is an ego show. That's not what a boxing fan is going to do. Boxing fan is going to respect every fighter, whether you like the fighter or you don't. But the fact that he's a fighter and he needs to be archived correctly, and so therefore he needs to be respected in order to be archived correctly, because that's the mess I'm trying to unfold with Black Murdersrow and some of the fighters that I'm talking about, because that's what was done to them. So, be smart. We're going to talk about fighters. Be respectful of the fighter that you're talking about. Call out what he might have done that you felt that he avoided this guy or avoided that guy. I do that. But be respectful of him, because all you're doing is hurting the fighter that you like. If you're calling this fighter names and saying he didn't do this and he's not all about that, then if the fighter you like fights him and defeats him, then what did he accomplish? Take away the ego, because that's all that is. It's not knowledge. And talk boxing. I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series once again. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you in the next conversation. Be well. Peace.